All right, let's get stuck into this panel to dissect the big stories of the day. Joining me, Sky News contributor Campbell Newman, former Queensland Premier, of course, and the IPA's Director of Policy, Gideon Rozner. Campbell, I'll kick off with you. What did you make of this involvement of the Queensland Government in trying to secure a stake in Virgin Airlines?
Well, look, Gleeso, I support Virgin being saved. I think it's critically important for Queensland and the regions. And I don't have a problem with government being involved. Having said that, the thing that really concerns me about this government is that they can't run the trains on time, as Peter Dutton's quite rightfully said, and they don't have a lot of money. In fact, they've got no money and it's all going to be on the credit card, and I don't trust them to do a really tough, hard-nosed deal. And that's what's required here, because Virgin really isn't worth anything, is it?
Well, it's not worth much at all. In fact, you know, I can't for the life of me, Gideon, think why any government would want to invest in a airline that's clearly struggling. Of course, you've also got, you've had your issues down there in Victoria, Gideon. You're slowly but surely getting things back on track. You're coming out of your hibernation. At least you can play golf now, Gideon.
Oh, well, at least. But geez, Gleeso, I mean, it took us a long time, and some states didn't ban golf at all. Victoria, I think, was the only one, in fact, that did so. But the Andrews government really, you have to wonder why it is continuing to inflict this cruelty on Victorians as it is. And the only reason you can think is because the advice it is receiving, as we know, is not the kind of sober advice you'd see from somebody like Brendan Murphy. He has lunatics like Annalise Van Diemen running around who equate Captain Cook with the coronavirus. Why should we take any of this seriously when those are the experts that the Victorian government is relying on?
Well, let's talk about China, because Andrews has had to defend this Belt and Roads policy. He's done a deal with the Chinese government. And at the same time, we've got this ongoing debate. We're leading the charge for an independent inquiry into exactly what happened with this particular virus. But the Chinese are retaliating with all these trade sanctions, Gideon.
Well, they are, and that's in their playbook. And last night, Stephen Conroy on another program on Sky rattled off a laundry list of all the countries that China has threatened with trade sanctions and the like. Look, the bottom line is this, Gleeso. It's a very, very fine line, because obviously we are very dependent on trade from China. We should continue to trade with China where we can, but at a certain point, as Scott Morrison said, we can trade, but we can't trade away our values. And at a certain point, a line needs to be drawn, and we need to diversify our export base as well. We need to start thinking about countries like India and Japan and the growing countries in Africa to export to. You know, China is not the only main game, and unfortunately, we've let ourselves become very economically reliant on them, and we need to wean ourselves off it.
Campbell, your thoughts on this China imbroglio?
Look, the thing that really puzzles me is how out of touch the Chinese Communist Party are in the way that democratic societies and communities then respond to this sort of agitation. I mean, I have, during my political career, been a strong supporter of the relationship, and I continue to be so. But my message to people like the Chinese ambassador is, if you think that carrying on like this, that threatening Australia, bullying Australia will do anything other than create an adverse reaction, you're delusional. And, you know, I would like for us to try and repair some of the damage of the last probably couple of years. But, you know, the stance like this by China isn't helping at all. And Australians don't like being pushed around. And as this goes on, if it continues, I can't see the government backing down, and I can't see, more importantly, the community backing down. And, you know, we will be looking to diversify our markets and not be reliant on China in the future.
Campbell, these anti-vaxxers, I think they're crazy, but we've seen one of the high-profile footballers at the Titans, a bloke called Bryce Cartwright. He's furnished Dr. Jeanette Young with a letter which basically allows him to be exempt from having one of these flu jabs, despite the NRL saying that every player needs to get a flu jab before they actually can play. What are your thoughts on players openly defying medical protocols that exist for everyone else except for them?
Look, in these circumstances, I would be saying that the NRL need to come down on him and say, well, you can't play, mate. It's as simple as that. Normally I'm not into this sort of compulsion. Normally I would be sticking up for an individual to express their views and take a stand, but these are extraordinary times, and on this issue it just tips me over that line. But it's the NRL who've got to say, well, we set the standard, we're going to apply that standard. If you don't want to accept it, well, tough mate, you're not playing.
Gideon, there's a lot of talk at the moment about public service wage freezes, and we know in Queensland they've tried to initiate a wage freeze, but they'd already done a deal, and I'll talk to Campbell about that shortly. But certainly in Victoria and New South Wales and Queensland, isn't it time that our bureaucrats, our highly paid bureaucrats, put any wage freeze on hold for the good of the country?
So there are millions of Australians who are doing it tough financially right now. There are millions of Australians who don't know how they're going to make ends meet, who might lose their businesses, their livelihoods, who might even lose their homes. And we're all being asked to make that sacrifice, or rather forced to make that sacrifice, because the government and the state shut down the economy to protect everybody from the coronavirus. Now, whether they did or didn't need to do that is a separate issue, and my views on that are well known. But at the very least, Gleeso, in the interest of fairness, we should have shared sacrifice. Every single person over a certain amount, because I think there are some, public servants like centrally call workers, for example, and frontline emergency workers who are doing a good job. We don't need to, kick them in the guts. But for a well-heeled, privileged public servant on $150,000 or more to accept a pay rise in this economy and in these circumstances is absolutely revolting, and we shouldn't stand for it. And incidentally, in New South Wales, they're looking at giving Mick Fuller, the villain of a police commissioner who stood by as police mowed up to people sunbathing in the park in cop cars to intimidate them, a pay rise to put him on a salary of $650,000. This is just patently absurd, and Australians shouldn't stand for it.
Campbell?
Oh, well, Gideon's right, Gleeso, and this is a big problem, I think. We can't have two Australias. We can't have the private sector, which has been decimated, and the public sector, which goes about its business now blissfully unaware of the pain and the suffering. I mean, the unemployment figure, by the way, talked about yesterday at 6.2%, being glibly reported by many sections of the media. It's a nonsense. Unemployment is now 10% at least. Let's call it for what it is. People who are on JobKeeper essentially might be with their employer still, but they're on welfare. It's no different, really, ultimately, than being on JobSeeker, and it should be called for that. So I turn then again to the public sector. It is time, as Gideon said, for some shared sacrifice. I personally believe the IPO right, their position was that people over $150,000 should actually be taking a pay cut. And I'm disappointed that so many of our political leaders and indeed senior public servants don't seem to get that as well. The least they could do then would be accept a total pay freeze for the next year or two.
Gentlemen, we've run out of time. Gideon Rozner, thank you for joining us live from Melbourne. Of course, Campbell Newman live from Brisbane tonight. Much appreciated, guys.
Cheers, Gleeso.